You'd think one of the most influential texts in history would be some calm, philosophical book, right? Well, what if I told you it's actually a furious, passionate, and really urgent letter? That's exactly what we're breaking down in this explainer. We're diving into an ancient letter of fury, known as the Book of Galatians.
I mean, right from the get-go, there's no, "Hello, how are you?" None of that. The author, an apostle named Paul, just jumps straight in with pure shock. You can almost feel his dismay. He is absolutely floored that the communities he's writing to are ditching the message he taught them so quickly. It really sets the tone, you know? This isn't a friendly catch-up letter. It's a full-on crisis intervention.
So the big question is, right, why was he so furious? What could possibly be at stake to make him write a letter like this? That's what we're going to unpack. We're going to follow his fiery argument step by step. So this is a gospel in crisis, and Paul's anger, it's not random. It's a direct response to a serious threat. See, the entire foundation of the message he'd set up in the churches of Galatia, well, it was being torn down by these rival teachers. A totally different gospel was spreading, and to Paul, it was basically spiritual poison.
Okay, so what was this different gospel exactly? Well, here's the problem. After Paul had moved on, these other teachers showed up, and they started insisting that to really be a follower of Jesus, any non-Jews, they were called Gentiles back then, had to also start following all the ancient laws of Judaism. We're talking big stuff like circumcision and all the specific dietary rules, the whole shebang.
And Paul's reaction? It is intense. He doesn't just say, "I disagree." No, he literally pronounces a curse on them. He says, look, even if it's me or an angel straight from heaven who preaches any other gospel to you, let him be accursed. Wow. So for Paul, this wasn't some minor theological disagreement. This was a complete, fundamental twisting of the truth.
All right, next up, Paul's divine authority. So, to fight back against this rival teaching, Paul's first move is to defend himself, to defend his own credentials. His opponents were probably saying, "Who is this guy anyway?" So he has to establish beyond any doubt that his message comes from the highest possible source.
And here's the core of his defense. Paul's claim is this: his gospel was not taught to him by the other apostles in Jerusalem. He makes this really bold claim, insisting he didn't just get this secondhand from the big names in Jerusalem, like Peter or James. He's basically arguing his authority is totally separate. It's completely independent of any human leader.
And he could not be more blunt about it. He says, and I quote, "For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ." So he's saying his understanding didn't come from a classroom or some mentor. It came directly from a divine revelation. He's cutting out the middleman entirely, declaring his message is pure, uncorrupted, and straight from the source.
And then he lays out his travel history as proof. His own timeline is the evidence. So first point, he gets this revelation of Jesus Christ. Then, and this is key, look where he goes next. He goes to Arabia. He doesn't go running to Jerusalem to get certified by the church leaders there. Nope. He goes away. It takes a full 3 years before he even has a brief 2-week visit with Peter. His point couldn't be clearer. He was not their student.
Okay, so he's defended his authority. Now Paul gets to the theological heart of the whole conflict. This next part, faith over works, this is the core argument of the entire letter, and it's an idea that would literally echo through the centuries.
But before we dive in, we got to get this one key term down: justification. It sounds a little academic, but all it means in this context is being declared righteous or being put in a right relationship with God. And that's the central question of this whole debate: how does a person get right with God?
So this really lays out the central conflict. You've got two completely opposite paths. On one side, you have the other gospel. Their argument, justification comes from observing the works of the law. Things like circumcision, dietary rules, all that stuff. But then you have Paul's gospel, and his argument is that justification comes from faith in Jesus Christ alone, period. Nothing else. And here it is, the mic drop moment, the thesis statement of the entire letter. Paul says a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. He's arguing that nobody can be declared righteous based on how well they keep the rules. Instead, it's faith and faith alone that puts a person in right standing with God. And let me tell you, this was a radical idea compared to what the other guys were teaching.
Now, we're on to freedom, not bondage. Because for Paul, this wasn't just some abstract theological debate, no way. This had massive, real-world consequences for how people actually lived their lives.
For him, this was nothing less than a fight for spiritual freedom against a return to spiritual slavery.
And he uses this really powerful metaphor over and over again. He argues that forcing non-Jews to submit to the law, well, it was like putting them back in chains. He calls it a yoke of bondage. He's practically pleading with the Galatians, telling them not to trade away their incredible new freedom for a life of just trying to earn God's favor by checking off a list of rules.
To really drive this point home, Paul pulls out this deep, really complex allegory from the story of Abraham's two sons. Let's break this down because it's pretty clever. He uses them to represent the two conflicting covenants. So first you have Hagar, the bondwoman. Paul connects her and her son to the covenant of the law from Mount Sinai. And what's their status? Bondage or slavery. They represent everyone who's relying on the law. Then you have the complete opposite, Sarah, the free woman. Paul connects her and her son to the covenant of God's promise. And their status? Freedom. They represent everyone who's relying on faith.
Which brings us to the next big idea, life by the Spirit. So if you're free from the law, what guides your life then? How do you know how to live? And Paul's answer is pretty profound. You're led by the Spirit. He starts describing this whole new way of living that isn't about checking boxes on a list of rules, but about a real inner transformation.
First, he lays out what a life lived against the Spirit looks like. He calls these the works of the flesh, and yeah, it's a pretty grim list. We're talking hatreds, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, envy, all of it. This, he argues, is the natural result of that spiritual bondage he was just warning them about. But then, in stark contrast, he describes the fruit of the Spirit, the outcome of a life lived in freedom, guided by the Spirit. And notice, it's not a list of rules to follow. It's a fruit that grows naturally from the inside out. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And then he says, against things like these, there is no law.
And here's Paul's brilliant conclusion to the whole thing. True freedom isn't some license to just do whatever you want. Not at all. For Paul, real freedom is actually the power to finally fulfill the entire point of the law in the first place, which he boils down to one simple command: love your neighbor as yourself.
Okay, now let's just jump forward in time by about 1,500 years to around 1517 AD. Because this angry, passionate little letter, written to a handful of small communities in the middle of nowhere, is about to change the entire course of history.
So why does any of this matter? Why is this letter so important? Well, because its radical, explosive argument for justification by faith alone did not stay in the first century. It literally became the theological engine that fueled the Protestant Reformation centuries later. Thinkers like Martin Luther looked at Galatians and saw a powerful charter for freedom from any religious system based on human works. And that idea, it went on to shape centuries of Western thought about faith, authority, and the individual conscience.
So when you boil it all down, this ancient letter was a battle over identity and belonging, fought 2,000 years ago. And the question it kind of leaves hanging in the air for us is this: how does an ancient argument over rules and freedom, over performance versus grace, how does that challenge the way we think about our own beliefs and our own communities today? What truly defines them?